Welcome to The Shift. I'm Dean.
And I'm Akasha. We cover the latest in all things science, technology, and culture, with new episodes dropping every Monday.
From the latest advances in knowledge systems and information theory to exploring emerging mediums of art and medicine, join us as we do bite-sized deep dives on the latest.
The shift is now. Welcome back to the deep dive. You know, we don't get to unpack something as fundamental as entropy every day.
That's for sure. It's one of those concepts that seems to touch everything, yet it remains surprisingly mysterious.
It really does. And you, our listeners, sent in some seriously fascinating excerpts from John Baez's What is Entropy? You've definitely piqued our curiosity.
It's always a treat to see people eager to go beyond the usual entropy is disorder explanation.
Absolutely. And you're particularly drawn to Baez's approach of understanding entropy as essentially the amount of information we don't know about a system.
Right. It's a mind-bending idea, but it's also incredibly powerful because it connects entropy to the realm of information theory.
And speaking of mind-bending, you were particularly floored by the idea that a single hydrogen molecule at standard temperature and pressure has about 23 bits of missing information. What does that even mean?
Yeah, 23 bits. That's a lot of missing information for something so tiny. To really grasp it, we need to start with information theory itself, the foundation of Baez's whole argument.
Okay, let's dive in. Where do we begin?
Well, think about how much information you gain when you learn something new. For example, if I flip a coin and tell you it landed on heads, you've just received one bit of information.
Right, because before I knew there were two possibilities. Once I get that one bit of information, all the uncertainty vanishes.
Precisely. And what Baez does is he takes this simple but powerful idea and connects it to entropy. He argues that the entropy of a system is essentially the amount of information we're missing about its exact state.
So instead of disorder, we can think about entropy as missing information. Okay, that's a pretty big shift in perspective.
It is, and it's what allows us to use the powerful tools of information theory to understand the physical world in a whole new way.
Okay, so back to that hydrogen molecule with its 23 bits of missing information. It's not like each molecule has a tiny little secret diary, right? What's the missing information actually referring to?
You're right, it's not about secrets hidden within the molecule itself. Think about it this way. If you wanted to perfectly describe the position and momentum of just one single hydrogen molecule in a container of gas,
Just one.
you'd need to know its exact location in three-dimensional space and how fast it's moving in each direction.
That's a lot of information for just one tiny molecule.
Exactly. And the 23 bits represent how much information would be required to pinpoint its exact microstate information we simply don't have in most everyday scenarios.
So it's not that there's something fundamentally unknowable about hydrogen itself. It's more about the sheer amount of detail required to perfectly capture its state at any given moment.
Precisely. And that's where statistical mechanics comes in. We don't actually need to know the precise state of every single molecule to understand the behavior of the gas as a whole.
Right. It's like trying to predict the weather by tracking the movement of every single air molecule. Talk about information overload.
Exactly. We need a more practical approach. And that's where this super useful tool called the partition function comes into play.
Baez calls it the Swiss Army knife of statistical mechanics, which sounds pretty impressive. But in simple terms, what does it actually do?
Well, imagine you're trying to understand all the possible ways a system can be arranged, considering things like energy levels and probabilities. The partition function is like a clever way to create a weighted inventory of all those possibilities.
So it's not about predicting the exact state at any given moment, but rather about understanding the likelihood of different states, right?
You got it. And it's a powerful tool because from this one function, we can figure out a lot of information about a system in thermal equilibrium.
Things like
Its entropy, which is what we're interested in, but also its expected energy, its free energy. It's pretty remarkable.
So it's like knowing the odds of all possible outcomes in a game of chance. We might not know what each individual roll of the dice will bring, but we understand the overall probabilities.
That's a great way to think about it. We're not trying to track every single molecule. We're trying to understand the overall tendencies of the system.
Okay, I think I'm starting to get a handle on this partition function idea, but then Baez goes on to calculate the entropy of a simple harmonic oscillator, and things start to get even more interesting. For one, this weird one pops up in the formula, seemingly out of nowhere.
Ah, yes, the mysterious one. Don't worry, it's not as random as it seems. That little one actually points to a crucial insight about entropy that we often overlook.
Okay, I'm all ears. What's the big deal about this one?
Well, to understand that, we need to talk about how Baez breaks down entropy into two parts, free energy and expected energy.
Two parts. It's like entropy has hidden depths.
It absolutely does. And that one is a clue to understanding one of those depths. It represents the expected energy part of the entropy. Even in systems where energy is constantly fluctuating, there's a baseline amount of energy that's always there. It's tied up in the internal motions of the particles.
You mean like that useless energy that's always lost as heat?
Exactly. That useless energy. It's not really useless, of course. It's just not available for doing useful work. It's a fundamental part of the system, and it contributes to the overall entropy.
So even at the molecular level, there's no such thing as a free lunch, huh?
Nope. There are always inherent costs. And that's what that one in the formula is trying to tell us. Entropy always has these two components. The free energy part, which has to do with the number of accessible states, and the expected energy part, which reflects these inherent energy fluctuations.
Okay, I think that makes sense. But one thing that really threw me for a loop was when Baez was talking about the Gibbs paradox. The idea that if you double the size of a box and the number of particles in it, the entropy doesn't just double like you might expect.
Ah, yes, the Gibbs paradox. It's a classic head-scratcher.
Yeah.
And it all boils down to this subtle but crucial assumption that we often make without even realizing it.
Which is.
We tend to assume that we can tell the difference between individual particles of the same type. But in reality,
We can't.
nope. Two helium atoms, for example, are fundamentally indistinguishable.
So it's like, if I swap my left shoe with my right shoe, technically it's a different arrangement, but does it really change anything significant?
Exactly. And this indistinguishability has some really profound implications for how we calculate entropy.
Okay, my mind is officially blown. But before we go down that rabbit hole, I have one more question that's been bugging me. Baez mentions that heavier gases have more entropy per particle. Does that mean a xenon atom is somehow inherently more mysterious than a helium atom?
That's a great question. It's not that heavier atoms are more mysterious, but rather that their mass affects what's called their thermal wavelength.
They're what now?
Their thermal wavelength. This wavelength is related to the particle's momentum at a given temperature, and it basically determines how blurry the particle is. In other words, how precisely we can define its position.
So a heavier, slower moving atom is like a bigger blur compared to a lighter, zippier atom.
That's a good way to think about it. Heavier atoms with their shorter thermal wavelengths require more information to pin down their location within a given volume, hence the higher entropy.
Wow. This is incredible. We've gone from flipping coins to the blurriness of atoms in the span of like 15 minutes.
And we're just getting started. Now that we've laid the groundwork, I think we're finally ready to tackle that hydrogen calculation you were asking about. Remember those 23 bits of missing information?
How could I forget? It's been haunting me this whole time.
Well, let's break down how we actually get to that number, because it's not quite as straightforward as with helium. Remember how we were talking about indistinguishability?
Yeah.
Well, hydrogen throws us a bit of a curveball because it's diatomic, meaning it exists as these two atoms bonded together.
Right, H2 classic molecule. So instead of just picturing a single sphere like helium, we have these two little atoms linked together doing their thing. Does that change how we approach the calculation?
It definitely does. We can't just treat it as one single particle bouncing around. We also need to consider the rotational energy of the molecule, the way it's tumbling and spinning as it moves.
So it's like, not only is it zipping around in space, but it's also twirling and rotating like a microscopic little, I don't know, like a figure skater or something.
A very enthusiastic figure skater. And all those rotations, they add extra degrees of freedom to our calculation, which ultimately increases the entropy.
Okay, so we've got the translational motion, the molecule just zipping around in space, and now we've got the rotational motion adding to the mix. But how do we actually quantify those extra degrees of freedom? How do they actually factor into the entropy calculation?
Well, for ideal gases like hydrogen, there's this handy equation we can use called the Sackur-Tetrode equation. It's a bit too much to unpack here, but essentially it allows us to calculate entropy by taking into account all the different ways a molecule can move and rotate.
So it's like a specialized calculator for figuring out the entropy of a gas, given its temperature, pressure, and penchant for pirouettes.
You got it. And when we plug in the numbers for hydrogen at standard temperature and pressure, taking into account those extra rotations, we end up with an entropy of, drumroll please, about 23 bits per molecule.
Wait a minute, that's exactly what Baez said at the beginning. We've come full circle.
We have. And in doing so, we've uncovered some pretty profound things about entropy. It's not just about disorder as we often hear it described. It's really a reflection of how much information it would take to fully describe the state of a system.
And it's crazy how something as seemingly simple as the mass of an atom or the fact that a molecule likes to spin can have such a big impact on its entropy.
It really is. And remember that handy tool, the partition function. It helps us navigate this whole complex world of entropy, energy, and probabilities.
It's like the master key to unlocking a system's thermodynamic secrets.
Exactly. And as Baez points out, this is really just the tip of the iceberg. He's only giving us a glimpse into this whole fascinating world of entropy.
Well, I'm hooked. What other mind-blowing entropy facts are you hiding up your sleeve?
Well, have you heard about the third law of thermodynamics?
That's the one about entropy approaching zero as temperature approaches absolute zero, right?
Exactly. As things get colder and colder, they approach a state of minimum energy and minimum entropy. It's like the universe is settling down, becoming more predictable. However, there's a fascinating twist.
Oh, a plot twist. I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
It turns out that even at absolute zero, a system can still have some residual entropy.
Hold on, even at absolute zero, but I thought that was like the ultimate limit of coldness.
It is. But even then, there's still a bit of unknowability baked into the system.
Okay, now you have to explain that one. How can there still be missing information at absolute zero?
It all comes down to the fact that there might be multiple ways for the system to be in that lowest energy state.
So even if your room is perfectly tidy, there might be a bunch of different ways you could have arranged your books on the shelf to achieve that perfect order. It's still the same amount of order, but the specific arrangement introduces some uncertainty.
That's a great way to put it. It's a subtle but really mind-bending concept, and it highlights this deep connection between entropy, information, and the very fabric of reality itself.
I am so glad we're the ones having this conversation because I need a minute to process all of this. You know, it's amazing to me how we started with this like seemingly simple question about a hydrogen molecule, and like here we are talking about like the very limits of knowledge itself.
Yeah, it's like we've tumbled down this rabbit hole of entropy.
Totally.
And ended up in a place where even absolute zero can't bring perfect order.
It's true. And it makes you wonder, right? Like, we often talk about information as this way to combat entropy. The more we know about something, the less random it seems.
Right.
But what if it's the other way around?
You mean, what if entropy is driving the creation of new information?
Exactly. Like, if entropy is really about missing information, like Baez is saying, then wouldn't a universe...
That's increasing entropy also be a universe with like this increasing potential for new information.
Whoa.
Yeah, it's like the universe is constantly generating new mysteries.
It's true. Even as it's like striving for this state of equilibrium.
Right, exactly. It's this amazing balancing act.
It's true. And
between order and chaos.
It makes you think, right? Like, what's our part in all of this?
Exactly. Are we just along for the ride, or
are we like active participants?
Right. Are we actually contributing to the information, the entropy? It's pretty mind-blowing when you think about it.
It really is. Well, on that note,
should we give our listeners something to ponder?
I think so. I think we've given them enough to chew on for today.
Definitely. Food for thought.
It's true. A big thank you to all of you for joining us on this deep dive into
the heart of entropy.
Until next time, keep those brains buzzing. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Join us on October 10th for the Shift event hosted by SF Tech Week.
If you like today's podcast, share your thoughts on X, Instagram, or Facebook. We'll be reposting our favorite comments. And that wraps up this episode. Thank you for tuning in. And remember, the shift is now. Agency, powered by 5D Studios.